Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eeriecast.com/submit. And rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
What I wouldn't do to have a more outdoorsy job. Game warden, park ranger. I don't know about search and rescue though. They often undergo rigorous training and people's lives are in their hands. Not to mention the apparently weird crap they see on occasion. Speaking of which, I've got a load of old search and rescue stories you'll just love to hear in a nice, tidy compilation. These are Tales from the Break Room. 1. The Last Hide and Seek by Gregor. I was 9 years old when I had the most traumatic experience of my life. I lived with my father in West Virginia. It was a small town next to a very calm forest and a small pond. Dad worked most of the time. Luckily for me, though, there were 2 families that lived nearby. The family that lived to the north had a son my age named Durden, and the neighbors to the east had twins named Michael and Matthew. We went to the same school together, the 4 of us. We even had the same teacher a few times over the years. At home, we spent nearly every day together, especially days like this one when my dad wasn't home. We were outdoor kids, and our favorite game to play was hide and seek. One person seeks, the others hide, and the rule is you can't move from your hiding spot, not until you're found. It was fun and suspenseful, but never more suspenseful than it was that day. That day we went deeper into the woods, maybe a little deeper than we were supposed to. It was Durden's turn to seek. I remember the other 3 of us running in opposite directions, trying to stifle our laughter. I found my hiding spot quickly, under a collapsed tree with leafy branches, making a sort of natural teepee. I waited there for several minutes, but oddly, I never heard Durden say the usual, "Ready or not, here I come." When 10 minutes turned into 30 minutes of waiting, I climbed out from under the tree, and I ran back to where I'd last seen Durden. Matthew and Michael were already there. "Where's Durden?" I asked. Matthew shook his head, and Michael continued to look around for any trace of him. For hours we searched for Durden. We looked until it was dark, and our childhood fears of getting reprimanded by angry parents forced us to head back home. It wasn't long until my father received a call from Durden's mother, asking where he was. My father confronted me. I cried. I broke down and told him about our game that had gone wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, a search and rescue operation was called into effect. Police officers, firefighters, and local parents all searched the nearby woods, but nothing turned up. Nothing until the beginning of the 3rd week. That was when the only people still looking were Durden's parents and a volunteer Forest Service group. They finally found Durden. They told me he wasn't alive, but they never told me the truth of what happened. Instead, my father forbade me from ever stepping foot into those woods. He made sure that any time I spent outside was under his own watchful eyes. It wasn't until I visited my father over Thanksgiving in 2017 that I finally learned the truth. Well, some of it. I was 32 then. My father said to me with an expression more chilling than I'd ever seen him wear, "Durden, he was in the trees." "What does that mean?" I asked. "Did he get stuck in a tree?" I was confused and ready to hear the truth. "No, son. Durden was in the trees. Several of them. Parts and splatters of him everywhere. The only place he wasn't was on the ground." I was shocked, stunned, breath stolen from my chest. What? How does that happen? Who did that to him? I didn't realize I was raising my voice slowly, getting angry. No one knows, Greg. Ain't no one had any clue for the past 23 years. I guess you now know why I kept you out of those woods after his disappearance. That's really all there is to this story. You might be wanting to know more, but I don't. I'd rather not know what caused my childhood friend to virtually become splattered all over the forest. Just be careful, because even in these modern days, there are mysteries, dangerous mysteries that can take your loved ones away from you in the blink of an eye. 2. The Ghostly Mayday by The Madness of Rose. I'm in the Coast Guard and was stationed in Oregon for about 3.5 years. During those years, I saw some pretty horrible things. A boat that went down right before my eyes, a man who breathed his very last, and a child who had lost his life when his schizophrenic mother threw him off of a bridge. That's just to name a few. Most of these things are unfortunately pretty average to your day-to-day life as a guardsman, but there has always been something about the sea that has held some form of mystery or another. In November of 2014, we were contacted by our sister station that there was a boat going down and that they had contacted the sector where all the search and rescue calls got vetted through the command center, that we needed to launch one of our SAR boats, or search and rescue boats. They already had a helicopter en route. We quickly loaded up and found ourselves at a breaking bar, the waves easily reaching 12 feet high with consistent white caps. We pressed on, our vessel able to take the nasty weather, and ferried on. Now we could hear the fishing vessel Artemis on Channel 16, the international hailing and distress channel. If you're ever in a pickle and need to get a hold of the Coast Guard, that's the channel to SOS on. They were begging for someone to come and help. We got their information, like how big their vessel was, how much they were carrying, how many people, and of course the rate at which the water was entering the hull. Unfortunately, as we neared the field of view, all communication went silent. The helicopter called us up on our encrypted channel and said that there was no fishing vessel to be seen at the reported location. They had just up and disappeared. They requested that we search the area for debris to make sure it wasn't a faux distress call, and so we did. We found a sheen of oil and a couple of bits and baubles that read Artemis on it. It was obvious that the ship had indeed met a watery end. But where were the men on board? We searched and searched for 36 hours or more, looking for any signs of the crew. But at the end of it, there was no one to be found, living or otherwise. With heavy hearts, we called off all our efforts and went back to operations as normal, getting ready for the upcoming holiday season. This is when stuff started getting pretty freaky. About a week after the search, me and my best friend Kevin, who also happened to be my boss, were sitting in the communications room, just talking. 2000 hours, I believe, or 8 p.m. for non-military folks, and we weren't expecting any other traffic to come over the radio that night. As Kevin opened his mouth to respond to a joke I'd said, the radio circuitry lit up red, signifying a call was coming over Channel 16.
Mayday! Mayday! Someone help!
A distant voice called over the radio, even though it didn't sound like a voice that would be of this world. It was hollow and sounded far away, like someone was shouting into a tin mug while falling down a well. A shiver shot up my spine as I leaned forward and responded to the call. "Unit in distress. This is Coast Guard Station Marble Bay. What is your position and nature of distress? Over." I returned the call as the radio began to go absolutely bananas. All of our radios started to light up as static poured through the speakers. Kevin and I raced around, trying to turn the radios down, and the static finally faded into nothing. A horrible silence filled the room as we both looked over at one another, wondering what the heck had just happened. "Check the lines of bearing," Kevin instructed as I pulled up our interactive map and watched as the two red lines crossed over one another, revealing a small spot on the chart to indicate where the call had come from. "No freaking way," he said, slowly, shaking his head. It was the exact same position where the Artemis had gone down. We called the sector to make sure that they had heard the call as well, but they said it was all quiet on their end, that they hadn't heard any calls for help. We wrote it off as a faux call, but I, to this day, nearly 3 years later, believe that the voice was from the lost crew of the Artemis, calling out for help one last time before their souls were lost forever in the briny depths of the sea. Please note that Marble Bay is a made-up name for this story. 3. My Dad and the Creature in the Woods by the TARDIS Lady. This is my father's story. He doesn't like to talk about it, but once you get him drinking, he won't shut up about it. From about 2008 to 2013, my dad worked for the Multnomah County Search and Rescue Department in the Portland metro area. He absolutely loved the work, but the job itself was grueling and often had really terrible payoff, whether it be the remains of people or drugged-out lost hikers. There were plenty of them. However, my dad always told me that there were things in those woods that not even God himself could have placed on this earth. In November of 2013, my dad was called out to go and hunt down a missing runaway girl in the Mount Hood wilderness. Normally, their department didn't deal with kids up that far east, but they had recalled all of their Northern Oregon teams to help search for this girl. Since my dad had 2 kids about the same age at home, he quickly packed up his bag and went to help. My father was one of the best climbers on the team, easily rappelling 200-foot cliffs without batting an eye, and his team was given a very gnarly part of the grid pattern that was customary on all searches. He and his team loaded up and headed down that way. They worked all the way towards sunset, belaying down the cliffside, screaming this girl's name. When the sun started to set over the canyon, most of the team were radioed back in, and they packed up because they weren't allowed to climb up and down cliffs in the dark. My dad was the last one that they were going to pull up, but as he was getting ready to head up the cliff, an eerie shriek, like that of a heron, but much louder, echoed through the otherwise silent woods. My father swears the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He turned around to see something, standing about 100 feet back in the underbrush, its eyes reflecting his headlamp. Now, deer are a common sight in the woods, but my father, being the avid outdoorsman he was, knew that this was no deer, especially when the thing actually stood up on 2 legs, like any bipedal would, and my dad finally saw the creature wholly. The thing was tall and skinny, with an impossibly large mouth that was split open by glistening, jagged teeth. Its abnormally long, scrawny arms hung limply at its side, the hands of this monstrosity coming to fine talons where fingernails should have been. On its head were a pair of antlers, like a mockery of an elk or deer. My dad couldn't move. He couldn't have gone anywhere even if he had wanted to. He and the creature watched one another for a few more seconds until it gave one more agonizingly horrifying shriek and turned away from my dad, silently creeping back into the woods. When my dad retold the story, he forgot to mention one little detail. In the light of the setting sun, he could see the creature's fingers were stained with a dried, liquidy red. The team began to haul my father up the cliffside just as the sun sunk below the horizon. His team tried to ask my father what was wrong, but he was convinced that he had been hallucinating in the cold mountain air. They walked back to their base camp, and my father drove home in silence. I remember seeing my father that night, because I've never seen a grown man, let alone my father, look so haunted, so terrified. The next day, they went back to the grid and hunted further into the next square. As the morning turned to afternoon, a shrill cry was heard from one of the female volunteers. My dad and his crew practically sprinted to where the screaming was coming from. There, half concealed under a bush, was what was left of the young girl. I won't go into any more detail there. My dad couldn't help but think, when he saw the girl, that perhaps the unnatural-looking creature he saw the night before had something to do with it. My father is no longer part of the search and rescue team. 4. Lights in the Sky by Regis. I volunteered once and only once for search and rescue. As an introvert, I didn't like to go outside, let alone crowd around others screaming the name of a missing person. But when that person is a childhood friend, well, you better believe I stepped up my game and helped out in the cause. His name was Ryan, and he had gotten himself lost in the nearby national forest. There were 4 of us in our group, separated by about 5 meters each as we fanned out searching every inch of those woods. Even my quiet self was shouting desperately for Ryan. It was around 15 minutes past nightfall when something bizarre happened, something terrifying. 1 second, everything was dark, and then the next, blindingly bright lights filled the sky above us, as if someone without us knowing had set up thousands of skylights above the trees. They came on without a noise and surprised us so much that the 4 of us fell onto our backs, covering our faces. For the next minute, the lights were there, but after that, they suddenly switched off. After a massive, near-deafening whistling noise, everything went back to normal. When we picked ourselves up, we were dumbfounded for a moment, but nevertheless went back to looking for Ryan. We found him not too long afterward. Him, along with literally every other member of the search team, had reported seeing those lights, and none of us have an explanation for it. 5. He Didn't Make It by Dean Castiel and Sam. I've worked as a paramedic for a while now. I mainly go out with search and rescue teams to treat people who are found. My best friend Judah is a nurse. We work together at the same hospital. He had a day off, so he volunteered to go with us. On that day, we got an alert that a 25-year-old man had been missing for days and had been spotted by a man who was hiking. We loaded up and took off. I was in the back of the ambulance. They told me not to join the search directly. Instead, they'd need me there immediately if they brought him out of the woods. So, as I was setting up the gurney, I got a call when they found the body of the guy, even though they swore they had just seen him. Then there's the really creepy part. I was talking to some of the police. One of them was a friend named James. I remember him being in front of me. Behind him in the distance was the tree line. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing there. and soon I could make it out. It was the man who was lying on the gurney, like a perfect copy of him. He was standing there, staring at all of us who were talking. I was breathless. As fast as he appeared in the tree line, he walked back and disappeared in the trees. I had no explanation for it. How was I seeing the same man twice? A man that was no longer alive. Being in this sort of occupation, you know just how many people go missing in the woods, some of which their cases are unsolved or strange. And now I have a newfound interest, curiosity, or respect for those cases. Maybe something bizarre is at work here. Six. The Wildfire by Anonymous. I am a Native American wildland firefighter, and often a search and rescue officer from the National Park Service. For the sake of my job, I will not tell you my name or place I work, but I need to get this story off of my chest, as it has shaken me to my very core. I hope that there is someone out there listening that will at least know that there are things in the dense forests that we as humans cannot comprehend. When I was a probie in the Wildland Service, I had a mentor whose name was Combs. Combs had served in the Marine Corps and was deployed 3 times, so basically he was a hardcore mentor. Many cadets wanted him as their mentor. He was a thick and burly man with many tattoos of the names of his brothers from the service, and many who had fallen in combat. I've had many memories of him waking me up and having me run a 4-mile trail with a firefighter hose over my shoulder. He was in many ways a father to me and my crew. One day I mustered the courage to ask him about a tattoo he had on his forearm that read, "Absence of light." I asked him about it while he had me doing my routine exercises. He replied that growing up he had encountered some very strange but fascinating things that he'd never forget. A bit shaken up, he said I was done for the day, then had me go home. After a few more months of physical military-style training, I was ready for my first wildfire. On my way to the base, Combs looked at me and said, "What you might see out here we cannot speak of. In our world, we often look for life in the absence of space and other planets, when we should be looking in our own backyards." Soon we arrived at a camp, a sort of makeshift station with other crews. There were 10 of us in all, including me and Combs. We ate dinner together that night, then got a measly 3 hours of sleep before Combs woke me up and the crew got ready. We drank some coffee quickly and then went out to fight the wildfire. Part of the job was also to keep an eye out and search for people who may have been caught in it, and this is where the bizarre happens. I remember spraying a thick line of water fiercely into the fire, which seemed to drink it up infinitely. It was my first experience fighting a blaze like that, and it really showed me how intimidating it really was. It felt nearly pointless or futile, but I kept on going. At one point, I swear I saw someone come from the fire, waving me down, crying for help. I could very clearly see and hear the person there, but none of the other crew reacted to them. I went up to Combs and said that we need to save that person, but he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "That's no person." I was confused. I turned around and looked at the figure. It was no longer screaming or waving, rather standing there, its figure being shifted and morphed in the flames. Yet, they no longer tried to act like they were in pain. I had never been more confused. Later on, Combs told me, "Sometimes you will see things in the fire that will try to get you to come in, but if you do, you'll never come out." Joining this service, I had no idea what I was really getting myself into. 7. When I Got Lost by Jonathan. Back when I was a kid, around the age of 13, I would go for walks in the woods, just tramping around in the leaves during the fall, or trudging through the snow during the winter, my favorite of the seasons. There was a certain walk that I'll never forget. It was winter, a bad one, and I had gone into the woods fully clothed, by which I mean I was wearing 4 or 5 different layers. My walk was slow and cold that day, but I didn't pay it much mind. I was more focused on my footsteps, trying not to get stuck in a hole that I couldn't see through the snow. It was because of that snow being so heavy that I soon realized I no longer recognized where I was. Better yet, I didn't know which way was back. That's when it all started. First, I was nervous, heading back the way I thought I'd come from, but only making myself more lost. An hour later, I was in a full-blown panic, unsure of whether I should stay put or keep going and risk getting more and more lost. When the sun was beginning to set, I was crying cold tears. I wouldn't be making it home that night, not unless someone found me. I curled up under a tree, absolutely freezing, the snow coming down harder now. For hours I shivered there, waiting for someone to come, waiting for a miracle. It was in that darkness that I saw someone. I didn't even hear them approach, but there they were, a tall, bulky figure clothed in darkness, standing beside the tree that I was under. I smiled, but quickly stopped myself from speaking a word. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a human at all. Their foot, which was on the ground near my head, wasn't a foot. When I saw it up close, standing in a thinner part of the snow, I know how ridiculous it's going to sound, but it appeared to be a hoof. Whatever it was that was standing next to me was leaning against the tree, one hand or claw on the bark, as it was only inches away from me. I couldn't see its face very well, but I could see that it wasn't looking at me. I remember wanting to soil myself, but I was afraid that it would smell me if I did. So I shut my eyes hard, and I waited. I heard it sniff the air a few times, then finally, it walked away. Still, for the next hour, I didn't dare whimper. Sometime early in the morning, a search party found me. It consisted of my parents, uncle, cousins, and some police. They said that I was covered in so much snow, they were surprised they saw me at all. I was okay, despite nearly getting frostbitten. But I couldn't stop wondering, what did I see that night, and what would have happened if it could have seen me? 8. My Worst Search and Rescue Experience by Bardo. In my mid-20s, I worked as a volunteer search and rescue officer for a tri-state area in the Midwest. It was darn near the epicenter of dozens of yearly disappearances. From the sounds of it, you'd think I'd have seen some serious or strange stuff over the years, but not so much. Most everyone is found, and those that weren't found like that were simply taken by bad weather. All very real and all very explainable. That being said, I do recall one experience that had me really freaked out. We were called in to join a search party. A young girl had gone missing from her family's campsite. When I met up with them, the parents were a nervous wreck and just wanted to see their daughter home safe. We combed the forest for hours, and around midnight, we finally found her. The 5-year-old girl was clutching a stuffed horse. When she saw me and Carl, another volunteer officer, she looked up and smiled. She was perfectly fine, perfectly clean too, as if she had been set there the entire time and nothing had touched her. I gave her a real smile and knelt down to her level. "Hey, are you Sarah?" I said. She nodded. "I bet you miss your mommy and daddy, huh? They're worried about you. You want me to take you to them?" Once again, she nodded. I gladly picked her up, and we made our way to her parents at a nearby ranger station. While we walked, I asked her a few questions. It got weird when I asked her what happened. She replied, "A big man took me." I was stunned. So she had been kidnapped, and this was going to drive the cops into a frenzy. I asked her who did it, and she said, "The fur man." I thought I misunderstood her and asked again, "The man with fur? He's taller than you and he doesn't talk, but he's real soft." Chills went over my body. At that point, I was done asking questions. My creep and weird factor couldn't go any higher than that. I returned the girl to her relieved and loving parents, and everything was fine. I told the police about what she said, but they didn't look into it. Just the incoherent ramblings of a lost child, they said. But I couldn't help but keep thinking about it. Who in the world had taken her? And who or what is the fur man? 9. The Screaming by Vivian. This is a quick and chilling experience I had while performing a search and rescue. It was November and still pretty warm in the mountains. We were looking for a couple who had gotten lost. Their family had called for help after they were 4 hours late for a barbecue. I had personally started looking into those hikers 2 hours back, and I was now walking through the woods wordlessly when something startled me. It was a scream, a woman's scream. It was definitely human, because the scream was speaking something, a very audible pair of words saying, "Help us." Instantly, I got chills, mostly because the screaming had come from directly above us. No, not further up the mountain, but upwards, like into the sky and above the trees. I wasn't sure at first what was going on, and then it came again. Another "help us," desperately hitting us from directly above. It was like someone was at the top of the trees calling down to us, but obviously there was no one there. I searched the area fervently for half an hour, but there was nothing to be found, and no other screaming came after that. When I regrouped to get some water and take a rest, I was quickly told that the couple had been found several hours ago. Literally seconds after I had left the search, they'd been recovered. They were fine, and after questioning them myself, they never made or heard any screaming. But still, who did make that screaming? And 10. The Last One in Line by David. This experience is hard for me to recollect because I lost a very close loved one in this story, but I believe it's a story that is very fitting for this community. I was 14. My family were outdoor freaks, constantly camping and hiking and kayaking. My mom, dad, aunt, and uncle and I, several times a month, would go explore new regions, forests, and parks with backpacks on our backs and walking sticks with our names on it in hand. It was a bit cringy, but I loved it. My family was close back then, and definitely in shape. One day we were hiking a lightly trodden trail through a thick evergreen forest in Ohio. The trail wasn't very wide, so we each walked in line, one after the other. My father in front and my uncle in back. I remember it being quiet. We were heading up a steep hill, so no one was speaking because everyone was out of breath. I was directly in line in front of my uncle. When I looked back last, my uncle was maybe a yard from me. I remember him smiling at me and cleaning off his glasses. But only 2 minutes later, the moment I heard that loud thud, right after the sound of rapid footsteps behind me, when I looked back, my uncle was gone. I had no earthly idea that that would be the last day I ever saw my uncle. He was never found, and you can even still see his face on those bulletin boards with missing people on them. It's been 5 years now, and if he's out there, I don't think he's alive. I can honestly say that no one knows what happened. My parents heard it too, and they think he fell and tumbled into a quick demise. But I was the closest, and from what I heard, those footsteps began in the forest. They didn't come from him. They were coming from something out in the woods near us. I know it sounds horrible, but I think something took my uncle. Maybe a mountain lion or panther, maybe. It can and still does happen these days, especially to those who are last in line. Number 1. My Volunteer Brother, submitted by Ingenix67. Before my older brother Gregory passed, due to complications not concerning this story, he was an avid volunteer in many different practices. He volunteered at our local junior high whenever they hosted a Special Olympics. He often went down to the shelter to help serve food to the homeless. I wouldn't call it a soup kitchen because we served sandwiches around these parts. Many people thought of my brother as a good person, and I would most certainly agree. As his little brother, I don't remember many negative moments with him. He never started fights with me. I'm sorry to say that any fights we did have, I was usually the one starting them. Always something about what he had that I wanted. I had a bit of a gimme streak as a child. Well, Gregory once had what he called an experience of a lifetime. It happened when he volunteered to be part of a search party for a missing child in the nearby woods. Now, this forest surrounded our little community. We live in the suburbs, and I grew up in a small backyard overlooking an intimidating tree line. I was always scared of those woods. Even when my mom told me to stay away, there was no need to tell me once. I wasn't going near those trees. But a younger child had a different idea, because a little boy went missing in the forest just beyond his home. He had been gone for about 3 hours by the time we got out there. The parents were panicking, and the police and firefighters worked together to search the forest. They welcomed any and all volunteers who were able. Of course, my brother jumped in without hesitation. They gave him an orange vest, so he was easier to spot in case he himself got lost. Then he went in, and my parents and I waited at the edge of those woods in suspense. My father would have joined him, but he had a very bad heart murmur, and he was currently at leave from his work until he had work done for his condition. Anyway, I watched my brother walk into those woods, confident and eager to help. We waited there for maybe 2 hours before we needed to go home to get my dad back indoors and to get some food in our bellies. Before we left though, we texted my brother to let him know to call us when they were done. Hopefully they would find the boy and we could drive my brother back home in no time. Midnight that same night, we stayed up for my brother. Altogether he had been gone for about 8 hours now, and we were already beyond worried. But the door opened at the last minute, and we all got up to greet Gregory. We had questions to ask, and we needed to know if he was okay. Well, everything seemed off. I mean, my brother isn't the type of person to ignore texts. He never called for a ride though. And when we asked him how he got home, he simply said, "I walked." He stood there at the front door. He was quiet, and he wouldn't look any of us in the eyes. Something was wrong with Gregory. Not once in my life had I ever seen him act like that. After warming some food up in the microwave, he carried his late dinner to his room, shut the door, and he did not come out until evening the next day. And only then did he come out to eat again. We tried our best to get answers from him, but he was just blatantly ignoring us. My mom was worried, and my dad was sort of pissed. I don't think any of us really knew how to handle this situation. Gregory was never a problem child, and I could tell that my parents didn't know what to do. We ended up getting most of our answers from the news, which my mother watched avidly until we had updates on the missing boy's story. The boy hadn't been found just yet, and the police were still investigating. "That poor family," my mother said under her breath as she continued to watch the report. But I was honestly more worried about my brother. I figured if he didn't talk to our parents, then maybe he would talk to his little brother. It couldn't hurt to try, right? I knocked on his bedroom door, but there was no reply. Being a stubborn kid, I checked the doorknob, and it wasn't locked. I walked in and saw him lying on his bed, facing the wall. He obviously heard me walk in, but he didn't seem to care. I made sure to close the door behind me, and then I sat down in his little oval chair. "What happened out there?" I asked him, but he didn't say a word. I persisted though. "Gregory, talk to me. What happened?" I was both curious and worried. It was hard to hide those feelings in my voice. "We didn't find him," he said in a monotone voice. "We know," I replied. "We just saw it on the news." "We found parts of him, though," he said in that same emotionless demeanor. Parts of him? My stomach turned at the thought. What had my brother seen? He continued, though. "Blood. Pieces of meat, that's what I saw. Around the same area where he had entered the forest." Then he began to sound more emotional. He was only 4. Then he sat up in his bed and faced me. "That boy's parents must be devastated. Either that or they're in denial. I wouldn't blame them." He stared down at the floor and said one more thing. "What the hell is in those woods that would do that to a child? We grew up here, and I've never seen something like that happen." I was stunned seeing my brother like this. I didn't know what to say, so we turned, laid down again, and remained silent for the rest of the night. The boy's body was never found, and eventually my brother came out of his state of trauma and depression. He was someone who wanted to help more than anything, but he walked into those woods only to see the gore of the person he was supposed to save. It was hopeless from the start. The weird thing is, we've never had as much as coyotes in those woods. So it really makes me wonder, what happened to that child? Who or what took him? What was it that tore the boy apart? What scares me the most, to be completely frank with you, is the idea that whatever did this is still out there. Number 2. I Was Lost in the Woods. Submitted by Brendan Barnes. A long time ago, I experienced the most horrifying thing. It was something I wish I could take back or unsee. Something that I didn't think I would have ever gotten myself into. My family went on a camping vacation to the Ouachita National Forest about 10 years ago. I was a child back then, and a very curious one at that. My poor parents were always having to tell me to stay close to them and to stop wandering off. Whenever we'd go to Walmart, for example, I'd be gone in seconds, exploring all the items and goods in each aisle. Needless to say, I had plenty of good scoldings in my time, but my curious behavior stuck with me. But I know now, I should have listened to my parents. Anyway, the first day we went camping, after we'd set up our tent, my family and I decided to hike some of the trails in the area. The place was beautiful and breathtaking, trees taller than life. I was having the time of my life just walking past the wildlife. There were birds chirping all around. It seemed like nature didn't care that we were there. It kept going with its own rhythm, the same as it did before and after we were there. The trails were longer than I thought they'd be, too. We were walking for 20 minutes and never once circled back or turned towards the camp. I was fine with that. There was so much to see. I had a hard time grasping just how big these woods were. I was young, and I didn't think so much land could be so uninhabited. During our walk, Suddenly, I heard the strangest bird call I'd ever heard. It reminded me of a whippoorwill, but deeper with a much longer duration, and at the end of the call the sound seemed to reverberate, or wiggle if I had to describe it in different words. The more interesting part to this sound as a little kid, it was the fact that it seemed to be coming from a bush on the side of the trail. I had to see this. I had to see this weird bird that sounded like an especially fat whippoorwill. I ran over to the bush, not thinking that I might scare it away, and of course my obnoxious steps forced something to fly out of the bush. It then flew into a bush maybe a dozen feet behind it. But I was determined. I tiptoed this time and continued toward that bush. I never saw it fly out of that bush though, but when I searched for it, I didn't see the bird anywhere. I searched the bushes nearby as well, just in case I missed it evading me, but still there was nothing. I gave up and decided to get back to the hike. Yet, when I turned around, I couldn't see the trail. Within what must have been 90 seconds at most, I had not only lost sight of my parents, but I'd completely lost the trail. Instantly, my heart began to go crazy, pounding in my chest at the thought of what I'd just done, of what might happen to me. The first thing I did was call out to my parents. They couldn't have gone far, right? Apparently, I was wrong. No matter how much I screamed, there was no answer. How could that be possible? Even if they were a mile away, wouldn't someone hear me out there? I soon found that I was crying uncontrollably, running in directions that I guessed were the correct ones, but all in all, I must have made my situation far worse. Maybe I should have just stayed put. I'm not sure. Everything around suddenly began to look menacing. No longer a dream world, the forest had turned into a nightmare. My nightmare. It had been 5 o'clock in the afternoon when we first set out on the hike, but hours must have passed by quickly, because before I knew it, before I wanted it to, the sun was setting, and soon I was immersed in darkness. This experience already sounds like a horror story, but what I'm going to tell you next will take a turn for the bizarre and unexplained. When I thought all hope was lost, the full moon suddenly revealed a figure in the distance, a silhouette that looked like a human. I was overjoyed. I was being rescued. Someone was there. Someone had found me. Whoever it was stood about 25 yards away. But then I heard them speak.
"Are you hungry?"
That's when my joy turned right back to dread, and fear filled my heart. Because the voice wasn't right. It wasn't a person's voice at all. It was this deep guttural grumble that somehow formed audible words. It spoke words, but didn't seem to understand what it was saying, as if it was only repeating what it had heard before. Then, whatever this was, it started to walk towards me. I turned and ran with all my might, but after all the crying and stress and thirst I had experienced, I was exhausted. Still, the thoughts of what might happen to me if that thing reached me, it pushed me past the pain. I wasn't even looking ahead of me. I kept my eyes on the tall, dark figure that seemed to be catching up fast. Suddenly, I was forced to a stop. I had run into something. I'd been running so hard that hitting whatever this was had knocked the breath out of me. I looked up. Standing above me was a man I'd never seen before. He shone a flashlight in my face. Slowly, I began to hear the screaming and calling all around me. People were calling my name. The man yelled out to the others, "Over here!" And footsteps began to rush toward me. I looked behind me, expecting that too tall silhouette figure to be only seconds away now, but it was completely gone. The trees were thin here, so there was no way it could have hidden that fast, but somehow it had vanished. I was reunited with a crying mother and a relieved father. They were handing me granola bars and a bottle of water, asking me question after question. They had been so scared, but I was fine, just mentally scarred was all. Then another man walked over to me. He had on some hiking gear and a backpack. He was very fit, and he had a very serious look on his face. He kneeled down in front of me and asked me a few things. Things like if I'd been hurt, and what had caused me to wander away from the safety of my parents. Then he asked me something weird. He asked me if I had seen anything. Now, I was a child, a scared child at that, so when he asked me this, I got nervous. I felt like I was in trouble for multiple reasons. I knew I would be in some sort of trouble for wandering off, but now this man was making me think that the figure that I'd seen wasn't supposed to be seen. So, feeling guilty for whatever reason, I lied to him. I told him no, that I didn't know what he was asking. But he went on to explain some things to me. This is what he said, as I've remembered throughout all these years. Always stay with the pack, and never be the last person in line. The moment you stepped foot on that trail, you were lost. It wasn't an accident. There are things in these woods that know how to take people. They know how to separate you without any trouble. When these things want you, there's no escaping it. You're lucky we found you. My mom and dad were beginning to look very worried that this man was speaking this way to a child who had just experienced the worst thing in their life. But I was intrigued and horrified at the same time. He stood up, saw my parents' confused faces, and went on. I've been doing search and rescue for the past decade, he told them. The stories I've heard, the things I've seen, sometimes I think it'd be safer to leave these forests to themselves. Then the man turned and walked away. It was the most mysterious conversation I'd ever had. To this day, I'll never forget what I saw, and I still wonder what might have happened to me if that search and rescue team hadn't found me when they did. Stay careful in the woods. That officer's words might sound crazy to most people, but now I truly believe, that there is something out there, and it does not have the best intentions in mind for us. Number 3. Haunted Forest. Submitted by Mr. Nowhere. I work for the National Park Service in a state I'd rather not say, because I know that when rangers share stories like these with too many people, it gets the wrong kind of attention. If anything, I want this quick story to be a warning. The woods are dangerous. I just don't want this to be an invitation for thrill seekers. I've been working with the National Park Service for about 5 years now. It's not very long in the big scheme of things, but it's enough time to have seen quite a few oddities. I've been on plenty search and rescue missions, most of which I'm happy to say end in success. People get lost in these woods, but most of them don't wander off too far. Then again, sometimes you get those people who don't stay put. Either they're young and unafraid, or they think they know what they're doing trying to save themselves after they've gotten lost. Well, on one occasion, a middle-aged man had gotten lost hiking some of the deeper trails. We'd been looking for him for 3 or 4 hours. The helicopters had already done several flyovers with no success. A coworker and I pressed on into the thicker woods, going downhill towards a small creek. Our thought was that maybe the guy went downhill trying to find water, only to end up getting more lost. Now, the deeper we got into that small valley, the more we heard these cracks in the woods behind us. This was never a good sound, because when sounds like that begin to follow you through the woods, it's something that wants to stay close to you. The sounds kept coming and getting closer by the second. Soon we began to hear what sounded like a dozen different sets of footprints around us. We didn't get a lot of sightings of wolves in the region, and when we did, it was usually coyotes or wild dogs mistaken as wolves. Usually all we had up here were mountain lions and the occasional bear. But this wasn't either of those. At that point, even I was assuming that a pack of coyotes or even wolves were stalking us. Then it got worse. We suddenly heard this screaming, blood-curdling screams like someone was being torn apart. They echoed throughout the woods and the mountains. I cannot say enough how loud this screaming was. I was sure that we had found the missing man. I was sure that by the time we got there, he'd be dead. We ran toward the noise, going full speed, ignoring the footsteps around us. Running so suddenly like that was sure to trigger the predatory instincts of whatever animals were stalking us. But we had to find this man, and if it came down to it, my coworker had a pistol holstered to his hip. After running for about 70 yards in the direction of the noise, the whole time the screaming never stopped, we stumbled upon a clearing, and we saw a figure bending down by the creek. The figure turns toward us, hearing our obvious presence as we came bursting through the trees. It's a man, middle-aged, sipping at the water in the creek. He stands up, walks over towards us, saying over and over, thank God, I thought I'd be lost out here forever." We asked the man if he was hurt, looking him over for any injuries, but to our amazement, he was completely fine. He wasn't hurt in the slightest, just thirsty and hungry. "Then why did you scream like that?" I asked him. He looked at me, confused. "Scream? I stopped yelling hours ago. My voice was starting to go for a minute there." "Well, didn't you hear that screaming?" my partner asked him. "What do you mean? I didn't hear anything. It was quiet here." "Well, until I heard footsteps bounding through the woods, and then there you were." My heart stopped flat. How could anyone in the entire valley not hear that scream? It sounded like someone was dying. There was whimpering in that scream. You could almost feel the pain and tears in it. How could anyone have missed it? We got the man some clean water. Then we got into contact with the rest of the team to get them to our location. Everything was smooth sailing from there. To this day, I don't know what that scream was. I've heard every sort of sound there is to hear in the wilderness. I've heard plenty of mountain lions and panthers in my time, but nothing sounds even remotely like what I heard that day. Even if you think I'm wrong, that scream lasted a good solid minute and echoed all over, never pausing or stopping for a breath. If it was a mountain lion, how could that man not have heard it too? Better yet, what was out there stalking us that night? Number 4. What My Cousin Saw, submitted by Dixie. My cousin Jeffrey was the kind of guy who didn't leave home to go to the woods, he left the woods to come home. He was camping constantly. He'd often go to work after waking up in a tent by the creek. He absolutely loved it out there. Ever since we were kids, Jeff would always beg me to come outside to play with him, though he had a bit of a hard time breaking me away from my GameCube. So basically, all his life, Jeff lived out there. I think if it wasn't so dangerous, he would probably up and leave civilization for good to live in those woods. Once, Jeff was asked to be a part of a search and rescue party. You see, some kid got himself lost in those very woods, the woods that Jeff called home. So Jeff decided to use his experience out there to help out this kid. But he went about it all wrong. You see, Jeff thought he was doing the right thing by splitting up from the group to quote-unquote cover more ground. Because of this, he ended up completely ditching the group, looking for the kid throughout the night. Even though after about 4 hours or so, the group had found the child, yet they had no way of getting in touch with Jeff to tell them that the search was over. He had good intentions, but he could be a bit hard-headed. Well, as Jeff searched the forest that night, he soon found himself surrounded by weird noises. He said it sounded like howling, deep, low, and slow howls. He was used to hearing coyotes. Most nights he'd fall asleep to them howling at each other and making the dogs in the nearby town bark. But whatever was howling that night, it was definitely different. It didn't sound anything like a coyote. Not to mention, he had gotten himself deeper in the woods than he was used to. He'd been calling out the boy's name, but these howls got him spooked, and he was afraid to make too much noise. He began to feel like he was being watched, and he saw silhouettes moving between the trees. By then, he had turned back towards town. He felt that if he stayed out there any longer, he'd be putting himself in danger. It didn't take long for him to start seeing the eyes, yellow, reflecting eyes all around him. The worst part, though, was apparently that these eyes were at his eye level. These animals, they were tall, whatever they were. He felt that he had no other choice than to run. He heard steps around him in the woods, but he ran harder than he'd ever run before until he was out of breath in the middle of a road. Ever since then, he hasn't gone that far into the woods again. He still camps though, he just doesn't go without the gun he bought after that experience. I know Jeff, and I've never seen him as afraid as he gets when he retells this story. And number 5. My creepy search and rescue story. Submitted by Danielle D. I had this experience when I was very young, and it has certainly left a massive impact on my life. I was 16 at the time of this story. Now, I'm about 5'4" and 100 pounds, and I've been walking and hiking all my life. I live in a remote farming village in England, and for the most part the place was boring and dull, but one of the things I enjoyed the most was getting to join the local search and rescue unit. I enjoyed learning and helping people, and it gave me something to do besides going to school and coming home. It was there that I met my one and only friend. Let's call him Luke. He was a lad at the school which every girl drooled over, but I never saw him as that. He was about 6.5 feet tall and a major gym nut who loved playing tricks on me. It was the middle of summer and I'd been at the search and rescue headquarters all day studying maps of the local area. My eyes were beginning to ache, so I took a break and went over to the soda machine to get a drink. I was about to sit down to have a drink when we got an emergency call over the radio that there had been a missing couple who had last been spotted going over Devil's Canyon, which is the most dangerous place and is only for advanced hikers. I should know, I was out there before and I ended up breaking my arm. We geared up and then we had a briefing, and we were all out there in 25 minutes. Luckily for us, they had left their phone on, so we had the local police trace the call. My father wasn't too happy with me going up there. He's the chief of police for our town, and he gave me a very stern warning to stick to the group. When we finally reached the hills, it was dusk, and we were burning daylight. We took the north route that set us through the backbone of the hills. We had been for an hour walking and scanning our flashlights in every direction, every valley and behind every rock. Yet still there was nothing. I was starting to panic, and I was praying that we would find them soon. Darkness had now fallen, and we were surrounded by dark, looming hills. I stepped up to look at the waterfall where teens like to gather and drink beer, but still they weren't there. The wind seemed to pick up as I headed back down. I hurried to catch back up with the group while I pulled my hoodie tighter to my body. I wasn't worried. I'd studied and walked the whole of this path a million times, so I never felt scared or frightened. The worst thing we had out here, really, was foxes. They might jump out of nowhere, but they would instantly run away from you. I found a stick along the path. I took it with me to help me traverse the terrain. I figured that the group must have been waiting in the clearing up ahead, so I made my way, and I was surprised to see that all the usual dead debris that littered the ground had been removed. The whole area had been cleaned. This was strange because no one was supposed to interfere with anything like that. We were supposed to let nature take its course. For example, if a tree fell in the forest, you're not supposed to move it, unless of course it's blocking a road or trail. But as I got closer, I could see a faint glow of a fire, and then I saw a clear circle had been made into the ground. Stones had been placed around the fire. I didn't see anyone around, and it was illegal to leave a fire burning unattended in these parts. In fact, doing so, there would be a heavy penalty. I was distracted by this, and I was considering calling it in when I had something break me out of my thoughts. I saw movement up ahead through the trees. I saw 4 figures, all wearing dark green hooded robes. They were walking, but as they walked they swayed left and right, and they seemed to be muttering, but they were too quiet for me to hear exactly what it was. I froze. I couldn't run. I raised my walking stick in front of me, as if this tiny little stick would somehow save me from these men, but I didn't know what they wanted from me. Just as I came to my senses, I felt a very gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see an older, middle-aged gentleman smiling down at me. He had the most perfect teeth I'd ever seen. They were brilliant white, and he spoke in a soft, low tone. "Why, hello there," he spoke. "My friends and I have been wondering where you were. We've been waiting on you." I froze. I didn't know what this man was talking about. I'd never seen him before in my life. I would have especially remembered that smile of his. I tried to sound brave and say, "Stay the heck away from me," but instead I ended up stuttering it out. This made him grin ear to ear even more. Then he said something else. "We've been waiting for a girl who's young and pure, who needs to be taught some amazing lessons." He just wouldn't stop grinning. I felt sick to my stomach. He reached out to place a hand on my shoulder, but I screamed and I kicked at him. I think I hit him in the knee, and then I took off running. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he gave off the worst vibes. I sprinted down the slope of a river. I slipped and grazed my knees, and I stood there in the water until I heard the chanting getting closer and louder. And soon I began to hear movement at the top of the slope I had just come down. I picked myself up, my knees shaking as I tried to move. I knew every turn and every path, but they were fastly gaining on me. I was panicking, but then I recognized the place I was in, and I suddenly knew where to go. I was able to retrace my steps that led me back to the beginning of the trail. Just as I turned the corner, I saw blue flashing lights and my father leading a group of officers up the steps. I jumped at him, overjoyed to see him. All I could mutter out to him was that there were bad men up there, that I didn't know what they wanted to do to me. I buried my head into his shoulder, and he sent his men ahead. He stroked my head and calmed me down as he walked down the hill. When we reached the bottom, I calmed down enough to tell him what had happened. I sat at the back of his police car with my dog Arthur. He was a retired police dog, a German Shepherd, and he made me feel safe and protected. Well, I'm sad to say that they didn't find the men that I saw that night, but they did find a bit of torn green material from their robes, and they saw the place they had set up because they left the fire there to burn out unattended. When I was old enough, I moved away from that area. I've got my own family now. I ended up with Luke, and we have 2 beautiful sons, and I still will never leave his side when we go on walks. Into the Woods, from Winter Willow. It all happened so fast that I'm still wrapping my mind around it. Any plausible explanations fall short. Here in Mississippi, we've become accustomed to hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods, so the fact that a Category 2 hurricane was heading our way didn't raise any concern. After Hurricane Katrina, no Category 2 is going to make us up and leave our homes. On that morning, I'd awakened to the usual morning sickness that I'd become used to during this pregnancy. My husband came to check on me, and after assuring that I was fine, he wandered back outside to begin tightening loose things down in preparation for the approaching storm. As I lay down in my bed, my phone rang on the dresser beside me. "Hello?" I answered, wondering who could be calling me this early on a Sunday. The number displayed was unfamiliar to me.
Is this Mrs. Maddie Winter?
A gruff voice asked. "This is she. How can I help you?" I answered, a little concerned.
Yes, ma'am. This is Ranger Jim here at Lake Geiger,
he explained.
Are you any relation to a Mr. Paul Randall?
The name he gave me was of my Uncle Paul. I knew that he had a fishing spot there at Lake Geiger. Yes, sir, I'm his niece. Is he okay? I cautiously asked.
Well, ma'am, to be honest, we don't know for sure quite yet. You see, we can't find him.
He trailed off to gauge my response. My heart rose to my throat hearing him say this. A mix of confusion and panic came rushing through me, and tears began welling up in my eyes as he calmly explained to me the few details they had. He said that some fishermen called in a report of a ghost boat circling the backside of the lake. Rangers managed to catch the vessel and board it to switch it off. They found 2 unopened beers, fishing gear, and a life preserver. They made rounds on the lake to search for my uncle, but with no luck. They found his truck parked in the usual spot, with the doors unlocked, and all his information in the middle compartment. Ranger Jim assured me that his team would keep searching the lake as much as they could, but it would be helpful if I came to the lake and filled out some paperwork. "I'm on my way," I managed in a hurried tone as I yanked my closet open, grabbing for my clothes and water boots. I hung up the phone, throwing it into my bag. As I made it out the door, I bumped into my husband, Greg. He could see I was distressed. He pulled me into his arms and held me tight. "Honey, what's wrong? Are you okay? Is it the baby?" he asked, startled. My husband was always such a strong man, truly a Mr. Fix-It. Any issue that arose, he would be there to solve it. At that moment, I could barely explain what the ranger had told me. "Okay, Maddie, let's keep calm and call your grandparents to let them know, and I'll drive you there." I was 8.5 months pregnant with our first child. I was happily surprised, but I'll admit, we were not expecting to start our family so soon after getting married. We'd been together 5 years before our wedding last year. As for my uncle, he was a solitary type of man. He had been married once when he was younger, but soon was divorced and never remarried. He enjoyed his alone time on Lake Geiger. He had a love for fishing and the outdoors, and could often be overheard planning one trip after the next to fill his time after he retired from the paper mill 5 years ago. He had a long-time group of buddies that would accompany him on his excursions from time to time, but he was usually alone. One other thing to know about my uncle is that he took water and outdoor safety very seriously. He always came prepared for the worst. I'd lost touch with him in the past few months, as I became so busy planning for the arrival of my first child. I'm sure he understood. Having no children of his own, he practically adopted his nieces and nephews. He was always taking us outside and showing us the joys of hunting, fishing, and camping. That's why to hear that he was missing was a shock to my system. During the 45-minute car ride to the lake, I couldn't help but play the ranger's words over and over in my mind, trying to come up with a rational explanation for all this. The life preserver was found in the boat. This was devastating to me, because I knew how out of character that was for him. If he had fallen out of the boat without the life preserver, I don't think it would have been a big deal to him, as my uncle was a terrific swimmer, and the lake was not all that deep. He always left his truck unlocked, and he never carried his old flip phone with him onto the lake out of fear of dropping it in the water. As we approached the lake, we could see the park ranger vehicles and some local police units. My heart sank as a rather chubby ranger slowly approached my husband and I. "Are you the niece I spoke with on the phone?" I recognized him as Ranger Jim by the gruffness of his voice. Yes, I am. Do you have any news? Have you found my uncle yet?" I inquired, trying to keep the panic from escaping my body. "No, ma'am. No luck yet, I'm afraid," he answered, looking downward. My husband stepped away to answer the calls that were now flooding in from my family. "We have a search party out still searching the shorelines and bog. If he's out there, we're going to find him, don't you worry." He glanced at my broad belly before excusing himself to answer a phone call. A nice red-haired lady approached my husband and I. She was wearing a park ranger uniform. She introduced herself as Carly, informing us that we could stay in one of the cabins on the lake free of charge until the search was over. So we settled in. I sat down, filling out the paperwork that the ranger had given me. Sitting at the desk in front of a large bay window overlooking the lake, I couldn't help but think we should have found him by now. The lakes here in South Mississippi are not very large, not like the Great Lakes or anything that immense. "He's been missing for 6 hours now," I told my husband as I watched him slip on his wading boots. "I'm gonna go help look for him. You need to rest here, Maddie. I don't want you out searching. It's not good for you and the baby to be stressing out. I'm sure old Paul is fine. Just a little skint up, perhaps." He kissed my forehead as he left through the door of the cabin. Hours dragged by, and the night fell. I sat on the porch looking out into the dark when my phone rang. "Hello?" But no one answered, just a scratchy static, like the speaker was underwater. "Hello?" I called into the phone even louder. When I was right on the verge of hanging up, through the eerie static, I swear I could have heard a voice struggling to get through. I recognized that voice. My Uncle Paul. "Uncle Paul? Is that you? Where are you?" My voice trembled with excitement at hearing that my uncle was still alive. I listened closely.
In the woods.
That was the only thing I could make out. "We have people searching for you. They'll find you soon. Just hang in there," I yelled before the phone cut out. Just then, my husband pulled into the driveway. Past him, I could see telltale storm clouds building from the Gulf. A rather cool wind tore through, blowing my hair in all directions, but I didn't care. I had to let Greg know the good news that I'd heard from my uncle. "Greg, you have to go back out. He's in the woods," I exclaimed. "How do you know that?" he asked. "He called me. I think his phone was wet or something, but it was him on the other line. He said he was in the woods. We have to call the rangers. We have to let them know." I'll call them, Maddie. You need to go back inside. The hurricane is approaching the coast tonight." I went inside to start messaging the rest of my family, letting them know that Uncle Paul had called me, when I noticed something odd. His number wasn't showing up in my recent calls. It was as if he'd never called at all. I scanned the call log, looking for proof that he had in fact called me just a couple of minutes ago, but nothing was found. I sat confused at how that could happen. Had I dreamt that he called? No, I was 100% sure he did. It must be this darned phone acting up. Greg came in with bad news. "Maddie, we can't go back out tonight. The weather's getting worse by the minute, and we can endanger other people." "But Greg, he's out there, and he could be hurt. We have to keep going for a while longer." I felt the heat rising in my cheeks. "Maddie, we've covered the park around the lake, and we've heard nothing and found no one. I'm sorry, but unless you can call him back and get an exact location, we have to do as the rangers say and stay put until the storm passes." I looked at the phone in my hands, scanning through the call log again with no luck. We barely ate. How could I eat, knowing that my uncle was out there braving the storm, lost and alone? I had the sudden urge to go out and look for myself. I felt for sure I could find him if I did. That night I tossed and turned, the feeling if I just stepped outside into the tree line, I could find him there. Eventually, sleep took me, but no actual rest came. I had a vivid dream that I was walking down the lakeside trail, and just off to the right, I could see my uncle lying there, leg broken in the freezing rain, begging me to help him. The dream was so real, I jolted awake in a cold sweat, my heart pounding out of my chest. I made a startled cry, hearing Greg's phone ringing. He turned over and answered it. "I'll be there in a sec," he responded. He got up in a hurry to go help Ranger Jim and Carly cut up a tree that had fallen on the side of the ranger station, completely blocking them in. He insisted that I go back to sleep. I walked over to the bay window. My eyes began to settle on a specific place. It was the trail entrance. A strange pull that I've never felt before urged me to get there. get there now. I took advantage of the incident at the ranger station to sneak out and investigate. I'd be back before they even knew I was gone, and hopefully with my Uncle Paul with me. I pulled a windbreaker over me, as I didn't have a raincoat, but the rain was slacking up and the storm would soon pass. I edged the side of the lake toward the trail. My mood changed from determined to a slight feeling of foreboding as I inched closer to the trailhead. Lightning hit the sky and thunder rolled. The wind was blowing, but not as intensely as before, and the rain was not coming down in sheets anymore. I could hear nothing but the storm overhead. I wrapped my arms around my tight tummy. The baby felt as if he was going backwards into my spine, and a nauseous feeling hit me hard. I stepped closer, thinking the sooner I checked the area, the sooner I could get back. My mind kept replaying that dream, trying to pinpoint where he might be. The trail was dark, and the wind from the storm caused a howling noise. At least, that's what I was hoping it was. We do have bears in these parts, but they are rare. Black panthers are rumored to roam, but I've only supposedly heard one once, and never seen one. The bend of the trail was coming up. I'd been on this trail a few times before, but not recently. The pain in my stomach intensified, and the cold was setting in. I began to worry that I was putting myself and my unborn child at risk. I called out for my uncle, hoping that he would respond. I strained my ears to hear him. I was about to give up when I heard a low voice in the near distance.
"Maddie, I'm over here. I'm hurt."
The voice sounded like my uncle, but at the same time, it didn't. Something about the voice unnerved me. I felt that I should follow to make sure that it wasn't him, crying out for me. I paced myself, calling back to him. "Where are you?" I shouted at the top of my lungs. My teeth were chattering as I pulled the windbreaker tighter around my belly to keep the baby and I warm. A sensation crawled up my spine. I felt intense fear and dread. I stood there, frozen in that spot, too afraid to look behind me. I heard nothing more than my heart in my chest and the heaviness of my breathing. I listened, waiting for the weird feeling to pass. The baby was still as well. He went from kicking feverishly to perfectly calm. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. It had the shape of a man, but as it grew closer, I began to shake uncontrollably. It had no feature of any human. There was a big smile on its face, lined with sharp, coned teeth. Its arms were longer than they should have been, and loosely hanging at its side. Its gangly legs looked painfully thin, and its head was tilted at an uncomfortable angle. What bothered me the most was the eyes. Very large, dark sockets, with one gray eye and one pure black. The gray eye almost looked human, but it was larger than any human's eye should be. It stood out in comparison to the black orb adjacent to it. Seconds felt like hours as this thing watched me. I trembled. Slowly, I saw its gaze drift downward to my swollen belly. Instinctively, I threw my arms over it to shield my child. It focused its intense gaze back up at me as it took a step closer, towering over my short stature. My mind was screaming at me to run for my life, but my feet felt heavy and refused to budge. The thing finally spoke, but not audibly. It spoke without sound, like its voice was channeling into my brain.
"Into the woods."
The voice growled, then made the most sickening laugh that I could ever have imagined. It reached a bony pale hand towards my belly, lightly dragging its disgusting nails over my stomach, still looking at me with that creepy smile. The touch snapped me out of my trance, and fight or flight kicked in. I bolted away from the thing as fast as I could. I could hear tree bark being scraped and slashed at on both sides of the trail. In my mind, I could hear it taunting me with its wicked laugh. I felt my skin on my arms tear and the warm blood oozing down them. I saw the end of the trail in sight, moonlight shine down into the clearing. It was so close, just a second more and maybe this thing would let me go. My heart pounded and I could feel pain in my belly like I'd never felt. My lungs burned as I approached my only exit. Then, just when I was about to bust out of the woods, it appeared in front of me, blocking my way. I almost fell backward from the shock. It could have caught me if it wanted to. It was just toying with me now. "What do you want?" I cried in fear and despair. I saw it reach its hand out toward me once again. "Leave me alone! Let me go!" I begged the soulless thing. How could I expect mercy from something I was sure had never been human, or even animal for that matter? It was something that I knew should not exist anywhere but the underworld itself. Its smile suddenly widened even more across its face as I backed away. A light bounced around behind it, catching my attention for a split second. When I refocused, it was gone. Flashlights and voices were the last things I remembered. The pain in my belly caused me to collapse. I was rushed to the local hospital by the rangers and my husband. They kept asking me what happened, and all I could say was "into the woods" over and over again. I awoke 3 days later. I didn't know what to say. Greg berated me for my irresponsible decision. The doctor said that the baby was fine, though, and seemed healthy, which was a huge relief. I lay awake in the hospital, thinking of that night, trying to make it all make sense, but no matter what I told myself, I knew deep down that nothing made sense. The thing I saw was real, but I knew that if I told my story, people would think that I was crazy, or making it up to cover up my foolishness. I wish that was the case. They asked me what happened to cause the scratches on my arms and legs, and I told them I had gotten lost looking for my uncle, and in a panic, underbrush must have scraped them. The next morning, while I was still in the hospital, the search continued for Uncle Paul. He was soon found, not far from the bend in the trail. He had been slashed all over his body. He must have crawled out of the lake and made it to the edge of the trail before expiring. The coroner couldn't say for sure what caused all the damage on his body, especially the wide gaping slit along his mouth ear to ear, like a smile, like that thing had. The theory was that perhaps he fell out of the boat and was subsequently hit by a propeller by unsuspecting boaters on the lake. The autopsy also showed that he died the day he went missing, and that he had only survived a few hours after that. His flip phone was located in his pocket, but no information could be recovered. I took the news better than expected, as my experience had numbed me to any shock that I could have felt. The only thing I knew for sure was that whatever that thing was had killed my uncle, and for some unknown reason it lured me out to it. Why didn't it do the same to me, I wondered. On the final night of my hospital stay, I'd resolved myself to forget about the terrifying figure in the woods and focus on moving forward. I let myself fully fall into a deep sleep. After all, I was exhausted from the whole experience. While sleeping, I felt that same uneasy feeling all about me. I tossed onto my side. Then I heard a faint guttural voice growing louder at a rapid pace. I sat up with a start. As soon as I did, I felt a sharp pain cut through my lower abdomen. I lurched forward hard, screaming at the top of my lungs. Greg rushed to my side, calling frantically for a nurse. The rest was a blur of pain and exertion, but 3 hours later, I gave birth to a healthy baby boy. I felt a rush of relief to hear his little cry. My husband proudly cut the cord, whilst I lay back. For the first time since my uncle went missing, I felt myself smile. The moment that every mother dreams about was upon me as they lay him in my arms. I looked over his perfectly formed body as he wrapped his tiny fingers around mine. But when he opened his eyes, a cascade of emotion filled my mind and body. He had his dad's one perfect green eye, while the other was an ominously familiar gray eye. I felt tears of disbelief fill my eyes as I stared into his. He then looked up at me and smiled. Kayaking from Lunar Chaos. This happened the 3rd week of July one year. I'd just gotten a kayak again for the first time after a few years, so I was pretty excited to get back out on the water and paddle off into the sunset. I made a list of all the necessary things I'd take with me to plan a camping trip that would require me to kayak out across a river and post up somewhere off the shore that was more secluded so I could stay out of sight. 1 hour of straight paddling with short breaks to admire how calm the river was, how the water looked like glass. The further and further you went out, there was quite an eerie beauty to it. It was very tranquil. After that hour of paddling, I eventually reached the other side of the river, which seemed to be about a 3 to 4 mile wide bank, and I could just barely see on the horizon the beach and marina that I launched from. Anything aside from the trees were barely visible. Being out there alone really amplified the distances between things when I began to think about it. Nonetheless, I found a decent spot to set up camp for the night, and I actually got to enjoy some kayaking without the weight of my gear slowing me down. Turns out that little kayak is quite a torpedo in the water. Once I got used to the balance and motions of staying in the boat, not committing the biggest flip mistake ever, I noticed where I was. It was shallow in this area, and my oar easily touched the bottom. The ground was really soft there, like quicksand. Not really an ideal place to get stuck, so far out and all by yourself, so I tried to make as best an effort to avoid as much of it as I could. Alas, not all things were meant to be. That's not even the worst part of this story. When I went back out on foot to explore, I got stuck about up to my knees in this quickish sand. I'm not gonna lie. I began to panic when I tried to move, and just only sank. It felt like something straight out of a cartoon, only with the reality that my life was at stake. With some quick thinking, the presence of my battle buddy Mr. Stick, and the back catalog of Bear Grylls videos I've seen since I was a wee lad, I managed to use the stick as leverage to lift and pull me out, slowly but surely. I managed to escape. That was my sign for the night to just call it in. But what happened through the night is its own story, because I don't entirely think I was alone out there. I heard something akin to someone screaming. It got farther and farther away, which was odd because I'm in the middle of what might be a marshland, and the nearest road is about 10 miles from me. So who would be out here when the sun goes down just screaming? I tried to plug my ears the best I could until the screams stopped, or until I passed out from being sleepy, whichever came first. The next morning, when I woke up, I noticed things were moved around. The fishing line I had set out was snapped. There were small footprints on the sand where I got stuck at. One of my paddles were nearly down the stream. If it hadn't been leashed to my kayak, that would have been a bad situation. But not as bad as what was to come. I managed to locate and collect most of my scattered things. Then I loaded up my kayak and assessed the situation with the water. It was calm, like glass, which was a good thing because the air was calm, the water was calm. It was a picturesque kayaking environment. It would be an easy trip back. I didn't have my phone to check the weather, since it had died and I forgot my battery pack to charge it. I had a 12 noon deadline to make it back to where I launched from, so I could get picked up. It's always good to have a plan with someone back home in case stuff hits the fan. And unfortunately, it did. Hard. I spent about 20 minutes paddling back to my launch site. I'd say maybe I got about half a mile away with about 2 to 3 miles to go. I should have been back before noon since I got up extra early to beat the tides, to make sure I had time to get there without making my ride wait too long. Shortly after, I tried to gauge the distance I had left to travel, I got hit with a really strong gust of wind. This meant one of two things to me. Either I just got a convenient source of wind power, or this wind is about to get turbulent, which meant the river was going to go from calm like glass to something more violent, which wasn't good. The wind never let up, and it began to cause about 3-foot wakes, I'd say. I was getting hit harder and harder every time one would pass. I took off my shoes to use as cups to get as much water out as possible, but in the middle of my final attempt at doing so, I was flipped over in the middle of the river, and all my stuff either sank or floated away, except for a bag I was holding, and my vest, which was hooked around my arm. Now, I wasn't wearing my vest, which was stupid of me. I was using it as a cushion, because I'd be sitting on hard plastic for hours at a time, and doing some adjustments on a kayak isn't all that easy. Or maybe I'm just not good at it yet. However, I took note that my bag was causing me to sink, and that I was in a pretty nasty situation, being that the river I'm in goes to about 60 feet deep, and there's been reports of bull sharks being in this river, with one actually being caught. I had a tackle box in the back, which had an SOS whistle in it. It was the only thing I gripped harder in my fist than my will to live, and I let the bag sink and wrestled with my vest to get it on properly to conserve energy, because I could tell that I was about to be in for the longest record swim I've probably ever done. So I looked to the sky, and I was in a reverse butterfly for about 3 to 4 hours swimming. From my estimate, I'd left around 7 a.m., paddling for a half an hour, flipped over, and was swimming for the rest of the way. One of the final moments when I'd been swimming, I was checking my distance to see how far along I was. I was making moderate progress getting back to shore, but with how much the current had sent me along, I was about 5 to 6 miles away from where I was supposed to be, and I had nothing to work with but a whistle and a drive to go forward. When I continued swimming, I got completely submerged by a wave, and while underwater, I could hear the motor of a boat. When I surfaced, I saw that there was a boat directly in front of me, closing in at about 100 feet. I had to get out of the way quick, or this thing was going to hit me. I think I was only about 2 feet away from the hull when it passed by me. I shook the water out of my whistle and blew it so hard. Luckily, it was loud enough to get their attention. Once the lady on the boat pointed at me, I felt relieved, like I finally got spotted and I could finally get out of that water. I didn't know how much strength my body had left until I tried to climb onto the boat. It seemed like my whole body was on autopilot for so long that I didn't have the strength to do anything but maintain the motion to get out. They called the DNR and made a report on what happened. I was seen by an ambulance and had my vitals checked. Nothing was wrong with me aside from just having fatigue from swimming for so long. And honestly, maybe it was the adrenaline, but the fatigue didn't come until after I was on dry land. I just remember being exhausted and wanting to take a nap. Definitely one of the more intense experiences I faced yet. And it was pretty fun, as weird as it sounds, to have your will to fight for your mortality tested. I oddly felt more human afterwards. It is strange. This last story is a repeat from an episode several years ago.
My creepy search and rescue story. Submitted by Danielle D. I had this experience when I was very young, and it has certainly left a massive impact on my life. I was 16 at the time of this story. Now, I'm about 5'4" and 100 pounds, and I've been walking and hiking all my life. I live in a remote farming village in England, and for the most part the place was boring and dull, but one of the things I enjoyed the most was getting to join the local search and rescue unit. I enjoyed learning and helping people, and it gave me something to do besides going to school and coming home. It was there that I met my one and only friend. Let's call him Luke. He was a lad at the school which every girl drooled over, but I never saw him as that. He was about 6.5 feet tall and a major gym nut who loved playing tricks on me. It was the middle of summer and I'd been at the search and rescue headquarters all day studying maps of the local area. My eyes were beginning to ache, so I took a break and went over to the soda machine to get a drink. I was about to sit down to have a drink when we got an emergency call over the radio that there had been a missing couple who had last been spotted going over Devil's Canyon, which is the most dangerous place and is only for advanced hikers. I should know, I was out there before and I ended up breaking my arm. We geared up and then we had a briefing, and we were all out there in 25 minutes. Luckily for us, they had left their phone on, so we had the local police trace the call. My father wasn't too happy with me going up there. He's the chief of police for our town, and he gave me a very stern warning to stick to the group. When we finally reached the hills, it was dusk, and we were burning daylight. We took the north route that set us through the backbone of the hills. We had been for an hour walking and scanning our flashlights in every direction, every valley and behind every rock. Yet still there was nothing. I was starting to panic, and I was praying that we would find them soon. Darkness had now fallen, and we were surrounded by dark, looming hills. I stepped up to look at the waterfall where teens like to gather and drink beer, but still they weren't there. The wind seemed to pick up as I headed back down. I hurried to catch back up with the group while I pulled my hoodie tighter to my body. I wasn't worried. I had studied and walked the whole of this path a million times, so I never felt scared or frightened. The worst thing we had out here, really, was foxes. They might jump out of nowhere, but they would instantly run away from you. I found a stick along the path. I took it with me to help me traverse the terrain. I figured that the group must have been waiting in the clearing up ahead, so I made my way, and I was surprised to see that all the usual dead debris that littered the ground had been removed. The whole area had been cleaned. This was strange because no one was supposed to interfere with anything like that. We were supposed to let nature take its course. For example, if a tree fell in the forest, you're not supposed to move it, unless of course it's blocking a road or trail. But as I got closer, I could see a faint glow of a fire, and then I saw a clear circle had been made into the ground. Stones had been placed around the fire. I didn't see anyone around, and it was illegal to leave a fire burning unattended in these parts. In fact, doing so, there would be a heavy penalty. I was distracted by this, and I was considering calling it in when I had something break me out of my thoughts. I saw movement up ahead through the trees. I saw 4 figures, all wearing dark green hooded robes. They were walking, but as they walked they swayed left and right, and they seemed to be muttering, but they were too quiet for me to hear exactly what it was. I froze. I couldn't run. I raised my walking stick in front of me, as if this tiny little stick would somehow save me from these men, but I didn't know what they wanted from me. Just as I came to my senses, I felt a very gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see an older, middle-aged gentleman smiling down at me. He had the most perfect teeth I'd ever seen. They were brilliant white, and he spoke in a soft, low tone. "Why, hello there," he spoke. "My friends and I have been wondering where you were. We've been waiting on you." I froze. I didn't know what this man was talking about. I'd never seen him before in my life. I would have especially remembered that smile of his. I tried to sound brave and say, "Stay the heck away from me," but instead I ended up stuttering it out. This made him grin ear to ear even more. Then he said something else. "We've been waiting for a girl who's young and pure, who needs to be taught some amazing lessons." He just wouldn't stop grinning. I felt sick to my stomach. He reached out to place a hand on my shoulder, but I screamed and I kicked at him. I think I hit him in the knee, and then I took off running. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he gave off the worst vibes. I sprinted down the slope of a river. I slipped and grazed my knees, and I stood there in the water until I heard the chanting getting closer and louder. And soon I began to hear movement at the top of the slope I had just come down. I picked myself up, my knees shaking as I tried to move. I knew every turn and every path, but they were fastly gaining on me. I was panicking, but then I recognized the place I was in, and I suddenly knew where to go. I was able to retrace my steps that led me back to the beginning of the trail. Just as I turned the corner, I saw blue flashing lights and my father leading a group of officers up the steps. I jumped at him, overjoyed to see him. All I could mutter out to him was that there were bad men up there, that I didn't know what they wanted to do to me. I buried my head into his shoulder, and he sent his men ahead. He stroked my head and calmed me down as we walked down the hill. When we reached the bottom, I calmed down enough to tell him what had happened. I sat at the back of his police car with my dog Arthur. He was a retired police dog, a German Shepherd, and he made me feel safe and protected. Well, I'm sad to say that they didn't find the men that I saw that night, but they did find a bit of torn green material from their robes, and they saw the place they had set up because they left the fire there to burn out unattended. When I was old enough, I moved away from that area. I've got my own family now. I ended up with Luke, and we have 2 beautiful sons, and I still will never leave his side when we go on walks.
Pale Gray Humanoid Encounter in the Wyoming Rockies. From C. Philly 100. This story was told to me by my friend, but it's pretty wild, so I thought I'd share it here, told from his perspective. I was camping in the Wind River Range in Wyoming, which is coincidentally the highest range in the state. I was getting ready to go to sleep in my car at the trailhead when I saw SAR leaving. They let me know they'd been searching for a hiker who had been reported missing for 24 hours. They said they had to turn back now, though, due to a big winter storm system moving through the area. Before leaving, they said they'd be back in the morning, but to be on the lookout. I said I would, but my hopes were rather low for his survival at this point in time. I set out bright and early the next morning. It had snowed about a foot overnight. My objective was Mount Gannett, which is the tallest peak in the Wind River Range, at 13,804 feet or so. I had my snowshoes on, but it was still rather slow going. I was taking in the natural beauty and enjoying myself when I noticed some fresh tracks in the snow. These were human. They were plowing straight through the trees and bushes and everything else in a straight line. Thinking it might be the missing hiker, I decided to follow them. I'd only gone about 400 yards or so when I thought I heard a familiar sound. It sounded like a baby crying. My human instinct took over, and I started in the direction from whence I'd heard the sound. What struck me as odd, however, was that the pitch never changed. It sounded almost like a recording of a baby crying played on a loop or something. I looked up just in time to see something dart behind a tree. I became a bit confused at that point, as I could no longer hear the baby crying, and I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing there anymore. I went to turn around, when something once again caught my eye. Something stepped out from behind a tree. It looked like a pale humanoid creature. The best thing I can think to compare it to would be that white orc from the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit series, although it didn't look exactly like that. The face was similar. No nose and this look of total hatred and malice. It had this sinister grin on its face that seemed to say, "That's it. I've got you." It was about 6 or 7 feet tall and extremely muscular. It didn't appear to have any hair or male or female parts. It began to walk through the snow seemingly without any resistance at all. It never broke direct eye contact with me. The only motion seemed to be a slight bobbing up and down. Other than that, it was very intentional with its movements. I started stumbling backwards, tripping over my snowshoes in my attempt to turn around. I heard a gunshot then, looking up to see an SAR officer wielding a pump-action shotgun. The creature screamed like a banshee before leaping back out of sight, leaving a slight trail of thick dark blood in its path. The officer ran over, helping me to my feet. He radioed that he'd found someone in such and such part of the grid. We made our way back to the trailhead together. We were met by someone on a snowcat. The officer said he'd shot a bear that had been charging me. He looked at me, though, knowingly, and I figured I'd trust his intuition. I mean, who would believe there had been a tall, hairless, pale white man out there preying on people. It turns out the other guy, who had actually been missing, had spent the night on the mountain, hunkered down in a hollow. He had made his way, albeit somewhat unorthodoxly, back down to the trailhead. I am immensely grateful to these volunteers, to whom I owe my life. To all of you listening or reading this, be careful if you're heading out into the Wyoming Rockies. There's something out there, and I have a feeling that shotgun didn't do much to slow it down. SAR Training Encounter. From Anonymous. I've been a search and rescue officer for over 30 years. Now I'm retired, living with my family in upstate New York. The story I'm going to tell you happened to me and my team during a training exercise in a deep forest in Pennsylvania. It was 1991, the year I officially became an SAR officer. I was at the top of my class, passing all the exams for the SAR protocols. My first mission was to go with my team to a dense forest in Pennsylvania for SAR training. It was a 2-day survival training exercise. We prepared all the equipment we needed for the mission, including communication systems, climbing gear, warm clothing, and everything else. Food and water, of course, too. We were carried by a helicopter heading to Pennsylvania. Captain McMillian was quick to remind us this was just a training exercise. When we reached the dense forest of Pennsylvania, we landed on an open field that marked the LZ, where the training exercise started and ended. We marked the field for our LZ with yellow tape, surrounding the whole area. Then we all headed out into the forest for our training. We found the perfect spot for our camping site, only 2 miles away from our LZ. It was better to stay close than too far away. As we unpacked our gear, preparing our equipment, we started a bonfire, relaxing while cooking our food. After that, we all went to our tents and slept for our training the next day. Day 1. Securing and monitoring. Early in the morning, Captain McMillian woke up and went out to secure the area, monitoring all the surrounding places. We'd set up a training dummy on top of a tree and left clues all around the forest. Around 6 a.m., Captain McMillian woke everyone up. He got us ready for breakfast before the training began. He explained that the first training exercise was to find a missing person in the forest, whom he had hidden earlier. Our captain divided us into 2 groups. The rules were simple. The team that found the missing person first would get a free ride and have the rest of the day off, while the team that didn't find the missing person would be punished. We would have until 6 p.m., with an estimated search time of 10 hours after the person was reported missing. Training began at 8 a.m. Around 4 p.m., both my team and the other team came back to the base camp, managing to find the missing person. We came back laughing and happy. Captain McMillian was intrigued and excited to hear how we'd managed to find the missing person working together. As the day came to an end, we all relaxed and talked until everyone got tired and went to bed. Day 2. First aid, navigation, and survival. The final day had arrived. The focus of the day would be on the most basic training skills for a search and rescue officer. Early in the morning at 3 a.m., Captain McMillian woke up everyone. He reminded us it was the final day, and he wanted to test if we were capable of performing the most basic SAR training. He blindfolded all of us, led us into the forest. About 2 hours later, we arrived somewhere, and he allowed us to take off the blindfolds. He told us to use our skills to find the LZ. He said he'd left no clues for us to find our way back. Captain McMillian laughed, saying, "The helicopter will be here at 8 p.m. I'll signal the helicopter with yellow smoke, and I'll see you guys back at the LZ. I hope." Then he left. We were all taken by surprise, but this was part of the training. We would have to find the LZ before the helicopter arrived. We worked as a team, trying to figure out where the LZ would be located from here, relying only on the skills we'd been taught. All I remembered was that the LZ was likely located in the northwest. After that, we all headed the same way Captain McMillian went. It had been 3 hours and we hadn't found the LZ, but we hadn't given up hope yet. As we traveled, we came across a small rocky slope cliff. The compass showed that we were headed northwest, and we had to climb this cliff, which was weird, because when Captain McMillian blindfolded us, we hadn't climbed or descended from a cliff at all. However, we continued on, climbing the cliff, until a rope snapped. This caused one of my teammates to fall, breaking his foot. We hurried to him, offering first aid to stop the bleeding. We had to carefully put his foot back into place. We were all horrified, but this was part of the training. We couldn't leave anyone behind. We worked together, using a stretcher to carry our injured teammate. It took us much longer to get over the cliff due to the teammate's injury, but we managed it. It was 6 p.m. We had 2 hours left before the helicopter arrived at the LZ. We walked through the forest, securing and monitoring all the surrounding areas. One of my teammates noticed something in the distance. He told everyone to stop, and as he pointed, we all looked in the direction he indicated. We didn't know what it was, but what it looked like to me was something standing on 2 feet with deer-like horns on top of its head. That thing was massive. From the distance, we could just barely make out its eyes, and what we saw scared the heck out of us. Its eyes were red, and it was looking back at us. We bolted, carrying our injured teammate. After running away, we couldn't help but feel like we were being followed. We picked up our pace, eventually hearing the helicopter pass us overhead, and we knew we were close to the LZ. We saw yellow smoke in the air, and we knew that Captain McMillian was nearby. When we arrived, he was waiting there for us, helicopter descending to the LZ. As we boarded and descended, I looked down to see if that thing was in fact following us, and I kid you not, I saw a similar figure emerge from the forest, standing in the field and looking at us with its shiny red eyes as we flew away. When we made it back to SAR headquarters, we explained to Captain McMillian what had happened since he left. However, we left out what we saw, that thing that possibly chased us through the forest that day. We don't even know what it was. All we really know is that there's something bizarre and creepy in the forests of Pennsylvania.
The following story is a creepypasta that was inspired by the terrifying and unexplained things that happen in our national parks. I was sent to find a missing girl in Yellowstone National Park, but what I found should not be biologically possible. From all_calm 1999. When are we gonna get there? I asked.
Just shut up. We're about there,
said my coworker James. James and I were on a job to investigate a report of a missing person on the southeastern side of the Yellowstone National Park. So, I'm reading the file. The girl's wearing a blouse. It's 42 degrees Fahrenheit outside, I exclaimed.
I don't know, dude. I've seen people on the side roads with nothing but a Speedo.
I look at James and laugh. It's rounding 5:25 p.m. and the sun is setting.
Okay, so the map says that we're close. Around 15 minutes.
James says. I look out the window and watch the tree line. We'd been driving to the backwoods for around 2 hours. Do you still have any cigarettes? I ask.
Nope. I smoked my last one an hour ago.
Frustrated, I turn back to watch the road. This drive had been so boring. Most of the time, there was a radio tower to give my phone signal. We drive in silence for a while.
You know, we're probably not gonna find her," says James.
What makes you think that? I ask.
"Have you ever figured out that we don't find missing people very often?"
I pondered that statement for a while, and I did realize that we don't ever find anyone really. Or at least when we do, they're dead.
"Bill, you alright?"
He asked me, looking periodically at me while driving. Huh? Yeah, I just never really thought of it like that before. Just as I finished that sentence, our radio came through.
Bill, James, got a lead on the missing girl. Over.
The operator's voice came again, saying,
Head to the south entrance off the side road 1/2 mile past Grant Village. Over.
"Punch in the coordinates,"
James said quickly, pulling a U-turn and speeding through the side road and onto the main trail. At this point, we were speeding through the trails, the sky turning a dark red, and the sun below the trees getting darker and darker. I never liked the dark. Even now, being 24, I still don't like the dark. I wonder sometimes, what could be out in the vast wilderness besides what we know? As I'm daydreaming, James hits the brakes and we stop.
"Bill, grab your flashlight and grab your pistol."
I grab my handgun and my flashlight to step out of the Jeep. The air was so heavy. It felt really weird, like that feeling you get when you're frightened and there's no reason to be paranoid, but you still are. We closed the Jeep doors and started into the woods, walking quickly, shining our beams of light in different directions. The air was so tense you could cut it with a knife. We walked for 30 more minutes, and we found something under some leaves. A small, brown sneaker.
"This is James. We found a small sneaker. Could this have any correlation with the missing girl? Over."
James spoke through his radio.
No idea, James. Keep it moving. Radio in if you need backup. Over.
James nodded and said,
"Alright, over."
Then he put his radio back in its chest holster. James looked at me and gave me the 2 fingers pointing up then down to make me move forward. So far, I feel that we've walked around 200 yards. As I kept walking, I stepped on a large piece of cloth. I shine my light at it. Looks like part of a blouse. "James!" I call out. He comes over to me quickly.
"Is that part of a blouse?"
"Yeah." He radios in the evidence and we keep going. I start to feel like something is with us. I don't know how to explain it. It's as if something or someone was watching us from the trees. James? Do you feel that?
"Do I feel what?"
Well, I feel that something's like, I don't know, watching us or something. It just doesn't feel right here. At this point, I think we were somewhere between Heart Lake and the Yellowstone River. We stop for a second and we pull out some waters. James, how long have we been walking here? I ask and he turns to look at me, then looks at his watch.
Around 40 minutes.
I look down at the ground and take a swig of water. I finish it, swallowing the last drop. Then, I hear something. I look in the distance and focus on the sound. I scrunch my face and aim an ear to the sound to determine what it is. It sounds like crying, with moaning added between the sobs. I slapped James's shoulder without moving my gaze. Do you hear that? He does the same as me, and the 2 of us listen for a while. The sound isn't moving, it's staying in the same place. We listen, and I look at James with a confused expression on my face. As I look at him, the sound stops. By this time, the moon was somewhat lighting up the forest in front of us, so I was able to scan the woods. It's then that I see movement in the corner of my eye. I flick on my light and shine where the path of the movement was going. I saw a human foot pass by a tree. Holy crap. I take off with my light and pistol drawn. I was following a figure running through the woods, and it was fast, like a marathon runner. James was right behind me and was saying that we needed to get closer. "What do you want me to do?" I ask.
Run to the left and try to run across her.
I ran to the left and tried to catch up with the missing girl. We lost her in the darkness. The two of us stood there for a second and listened again. We looked around. Then I looked at James. "Did you see how fast she was running?"
I don't know how a little girl can run so fast,
James said, breathing heavily. We caught our breath, and the sobbing, moaning sound came again from the left of us. We decided to go on a slower approach. We methodically moved in an oval shape to the sound. I was creeping up on them, and I didn't have my light on, but something looked off with how her body looked. Her back was humped, and she had her arms retracted under her chest, like a T-Rex is portrayed having its arms held under its chest. At this time, we were 50 feet away from her. James sounded off at her, saying,
"Little girl, we're rangers. We're here to take you."
He stopped dead in his tracks. I whispered to him, "What's the matter?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the girl, mumbling something in fright. What is he looking at? I thought to myself, feeling that there was no reason to be afraid. It's just a little girl, I told myself, turning on and aiming my flashlight at her. I'll try my best to describe what I saw. The memory itself has already given me goosebumps just thinking about it. When I turned on the light, the little girl was standing with her back to me. The first thing I noticed was how messed up her back was. It was bent in an unnatural angle downward into a hump. Her vertebrae made it look like she had spikes coming off of her back. She slowly turned around, and when she did, I could feel all my blood leave my face, and a sharp, bone-chilling coldness ran down my body. When she made the full turn to face me, I saw that her legs were like birds' legs. The knee was bent inwards, and her lower legs were coming out past her hips. I looked further up. She was so malnourished that her pelvis was showing through her skin. Her arms had shortened, and she only had 3 fingers on each hand. Her head and neck are what haunts me the most, as her neck had merged with the back of her head and connected with the rest of her skin. And her mouth. God, the mouth. It looked like her cheeks had been sawn down the side and went down into her neck. She moved her mouth and the jaw squirmed and shook with each movement. All the while, she was moaning and crying at us, screaming at us with a gurgled tone in the back of her throat. She squatted her legs and they went out behind her, and when she did that, she started to stumble towards us, screaming and crying in a gurgled moan. I looked at James, who had his gun drawn on her. He was crying profusely, tears running down his cheeks. He was mumbling, shaking all over his body. The girl at this point hadn't made a move towards him, and when she did, he shot her in the shoulder. She turned, screamed, and cried, then began to run at him. He opened fire upon her again, unloading the entire magazine into her. She wouldn't fall. He turned and yelled at me.
"Bill, shoot it!"
I did as I was told, aiming at her and unloading my whole magazine as well. As we sat there, minds running blanks, we just stared at each other. James slowly grabbed his radio and held it tight in his hand, shaking slightly.
We have a code 1096 on location N.
After that was sent, 15 minutes later, a team of men wearing MOPP gear stepped out of Humvees, telling us to get in the vehicle. As I got in and drove away, I saw the men in suits pour gasoline onto the thing we shot and burn the body. I quit that night. What I saw that night is something I will never forget and will never leave my mind. I don't have answers to the things I think about at night. And now that I'm typing this, those are answers I realize I don't want to learn. The unexplainable things I experienced at Yellowstone National Park. From X. Parker. I don't want these experiences I'm about to share with you to scare you from visiting your favorite national forests. Go out into nature. Enjoy yourselves. It's healthy for you and your children. Simply take this recollection as a warning. Things happen out in the woods. Things you can't always explain or be ready for. I worked for Yellowstone National Park in the 90s for a few years before moving to the Ozarks and working as a game warden. As a Yellowstone Park ranger, my tasks were varied. There were times I would act as a tour guide, or at the very least a guest to tourist groups. I would explain facts about the forests, the animals and plants that prosper there, and Yellowstone's history. These were infrequent occasions, however. Usually I would be checking in on campers, hikers, and such, responding to reports of troublesome guests, poaching, littered or even abandoned campsites, campfires left burning, etc. Sometimes I would be tasked with recording data on animal populations, especially when one group became a bit too populated, which can endanger surrounding ecosystems. You probably wouldn't think it, but if deer, for example, become too numerous, they can destroy the environment, driving out populations of prey, which can drive out populations of predators. It was rare that I had to take part in search and rescue, but it did happen. People get lost in national forests. Yellowstone is certainly no stranger to missing persons. Usually these folks are found an hour or two after losing their way or stumbling off the path, unable to find their way back. This brings me to my first strange experience. Early one summer, a middle-aged male hiker was reported missing from his group. I was called to take part in the search and rescue operation. On an ATV, I double-checked and triple-checked the path he was last seen at. When that was fruitless, I got off the ATV and began to trek into the woods. Now, inexperienced people who become lost usually behave in similar ways. The force of gravity tends to make people want to walk downward, downhill, and people tend to find and stay for some time in open areas. So I began to walk downhill, keeping an eye out for openings in the trees, groves and such, and especially keeping an ear out for water sources. People are also drawn toward water. Who knew? Sarcasm aside, I continued walking, keeping an eye on my handheld GPS. This thing would keep me from getting lost, unless the batteries went out, or if it got too dark to read, because back then the screen didn't have a light behind it. I walked through ever-thickening brush for about 20 minutes, until it became too thick for me to travel through. No problem there. If it was too much for me to travel through, it'd be too much for the hiker too. I began to walk alongside the brush. Every so often, I would call out, "Forest Service! Anybody out here?" The sun was beginning to set by then, so I wanted to start making my way back to the path. I would get on the ATV and join back up with the main group of search and rescue. I let them know my plan via walkie-talkie, but when they replied, they told me, "Come back in, Parker. Missing hiker was recovered about 10 minutes ago." Great, I thought. They could have told me when they found him. To be honest, the team was usually good about that kind of information and updates. If anything, this was just a rare miss from them. With a sigh, I began to walk back uphill. But I twisted my ankle at some point and landed myself right in the brush next to me. As I began to pick myself up, untangling my body from the brush, I started to hear footsteps. They were coming from right in front of me. Right away, I thought it was deer, so I didn't call out or anything of the sort. I just continued to pick myself up, knowing that when they heard me rustling about, these deer would just go the other way. However, the footsteps continued to approach me. They were heavy, deliberate, and steady. As these sounds continued, I began to feel a bit worried. When I worked for Yellowstone, the wolf population was extremely low, but it wasn't non-existent. However, they shouldn't be in this area of the park. Nonetheless, I was a little bit anxious. There were few things out there heavy enough to make that kind of footstep. Was it a person? A bear? A moose? All of which would be bad news for me. I called out then. If it was a person, they would respond or come towards me. If it was an animal, they would likely be scared away. Forest Service? Anyone there? As I listened, there was not even a break in the footsteps. They continued inching closer to me, heavy and slow, just as before. I began to wonder, now why wouldn't a person call back? I started to think maybe it was someone up to no good, or someone who was simply minding their own business. I yanked my left arm, which was still stuck in the brush. My sleeve was caught on a thick bramble. It was tough to pull it out, as I was trying my best not to rip my uniform. But the closer the footsteps got to me, the more hurried I felt. As they drew nearer, these steps sounded human, or at least bipedal. My back was turned toward the noises now, as I focused my attention on getting my arm out of the bramble. The steps got closer and closer, until I swear they were right behind me. And at that point, I said screw it, and I yanked with all the force I had. A huge rip tore through my sleeve, and the skin underneath was ripped up a bit, causing me to bleed. But I was freed. I turned around instantly after that, ignoring my stinging injury. As I turned, no one was there. It was the most bizarre sensation I felt then, like I was not alone. It felt as if I was staring right into the face of a stranger. And yet, all I saw around me was darkening forest at sundown. Perhaps it was instinctual, but every fiber of my being told me not to move. So I stayed put, staring into the same direction, breathing so quietly that even I couldn't hear it. I swear I must have stayed that way for about 10 minutes straight, until suddenly I heard footsteps right in front of me, walking away. I kid you not, these footsteps sounded inches away from me, as if someone had actually been standing face to face with me the entire time, someone that I couldn't see. Through the fear and panic I felt, I suddenly had the idea to look at the ground. Footsteps would mean disturbing the ground, so I scanned the forest floor, looking for disturbances as this entity walked. But the most I saw, and I swear I saw this, was the small and thin branch of a young tree being moved out of the way by a force that could not be seen by the human eye. I stayed frozen. My mind was so far beyond boggled, I didn't even know what to think or do. What in the world had walked up to me? Why couldn't I see it? And what did it want? Why did my body scream at me not to move? What was going to happen to me if I had? I stayed there until I could no longer hear those footsteps. The moment I could no longer hear them, I ran so fast uphill, ignoring my wound on my arm and my twisted ankle. I came out about 40 yards away from the ATV, so I ran up the trail back to it. I hopped on and floored it down the trail. If my boss had seen how fast I was going, I probably would have gotten written up or fired. Hikers were frequent on these trails. The speed I was going, I could have hurt someone or worse. But at the time, I was so terrified and confused, I didn't even think about it. This was the kind of experience that sticks with you, but you're sort of afraid to talk about it for a while. I remember I tested the waters with my coworkers. On lunch breaks or after hours, I would often ask them vague-ish questions about things they've seen in the forest. Like, what's the weirdest experience you've ever had out in Yellowstone? Or, have you ever heard strange footsteps out there? But for the rest of my time working there, I never did tell the story like I am here to my coworkers. Now on to the second experience. During spring one year, we were under a very high fire danger warning. Everybody was alert about possible fire hazards. The last thing we'd want was a ravaging forest fire burning through Yellowstone. I remember getting a call one day. There was a report of smoke coming from an area where campfires were prohibited. I immediately began to make my way to the campsite. At Yellowstone National Park, at least back when I worked there, campfires were only allowed in designated camping grounds and only within the fire rings that are installed there. And you can't walk away from a campfire. It must be attended at all times. I've had to talk with campers a lot about this. People really enjoyed making campfires when and where they weren't supposed to. And more campers than I'd like to admit would leave the campgrounds with their fire still going or hot. Remember everyone, if you've got a campfire, put it out before you go and make sure it's cold to the touch. Anyway, before long I was at this campsite. It was nowhere near a proper campgrounds. It was a makeshift campsite, apparently from someone who thought they were going to rough it out in the woods. Or it could have been someone who was homeless, a drifter or some such. Both of these were not uncommon. The campsite was made up of a tattered tarp, which was tied using string to a couple of tree branches, creating a rough shelter. Next to it was an old pair of shoes. One of the shoes had a hole at the toe. Definitely not the type of shoe you'd want to walk around with out here in the woods. 5 soaking wet black socks were hung over another tree branch nearby. And around the perimeter, I saw footprints, shoeless, sockless footprints. They led out and away from the campsite. This was bizarre. You really don't want to be walking around Yellowstone without shoes or boots. But the footprints appeared to lead away, and I did not see any footprints coming back towards the campsite. Not barefoot ones, anyway. My assumption was I'd happened upon their campsite while they were temporarily gone. Using a water bottle, I threw some water on the still burning embers of the campfire, and using a stick, I stirred it about, mixing dirt and ash and water together. I gave it a poke, and it was cold. Then I leaned next to a nearby tree, waiting for my host to come back. He was going to get a verbal warning, and if he wasn't cooperative, he would be fined. After a few minutes passed by, no one came back to the campsite, so I began to walk around, seeing if I could see or hear someone nearby. But I couldn't. I had no idea where they'd gone. I figured they wouldn't have gone far without shoes or socks. As I circled back to the makeshift campsite, I hit my head on something. I looked up. It was a weird wooden ornament tied to a low-hanging tree branch. In fact, as I looked around, there were more of the same kind of ornament hanging around, all tied to tree branches. These ornaments were made of wood, woven together into a spherical form, and through the many small gaps in the wood, I could see that there was something inside. When I shook it, there was definitely something in it. I reached for a different one nearby without pulling it off the tree. I shook it too. And again, something rattled inside. Curious, I began to pry back the woven ornament until I could see what was inside. A strange smell hit me as I did, a smell like gangrene and rot. Now, it took me some time to understand what I was looking at inside this little ornament. There was just one object. It was small and about the size of my thumb. It was sort of gray and brown, with fibrous little dark brown pieces at the end. It was rounded at the other end. Then I realized it was a toenail. A toenail completely ripped off the big toe and placed inside this ornament. I dropped it then, bile rising in my throat as I wanted to gag. I looked around at all these different ornaments. I remember thinking, No freaking way. Did each one really contain a ripped off and decaying toenail? What kind of person would do this? And why were they decorating the trees around here? Right away, I got on my walkie-talkie and reported it. I went back to the trail, waiting for one of the other park rangers who said they would show up. They were supposed to be bringing a camera. Unfortunately, it took them about an hour to get there. By the time they arrived and we went back to the makeshift campsite, everything was in place, except, of course, for the toenail ornaments. As I looked at the forest floor, there was now at least 100 bare footprints that matched the ones before, now circling the campsite. Whoever had been camping here had come back the moment I was gone, and they took their disgusting decorations with them. What really creeped me out was the timing, because if they came back just as I left, that means they'd probably been watching me the entire time I was in their camp, and I hadn't seen nor heard them. This was yet another experience I didn't share with my coworkers. After all, the guy came back and got all the disgusting evidence I would have showed them. Now for my final unexplainable encounter out in Yellowstone. This one was really worrisome for me, because it actually directly affected me. The previous two experiences I shared with you were really just me seeing and hearing some weird crap, but this time around, something happened to me. On this occasion, I had the week off, and I spent part of it as a hiker at Yellowstone. Being employed there, I pretty much knew the place like the back of my hand. I wanted to enjoy my favorite spots, the most beautiful views, and the quietest paths. One morning, I was hiking along a mountain trail at 9 a.m. Mentioning the time here is very important. I had come to a bluff with a gorgeous view, so I sat down there and enjoyed some granola and cold coffee for the next half hour, so by then it would be around 9:30. It was a gorgeous cloudy day, and it was starting to sprinkle. Fine by me. I'd brought a poncho, and there was a gazebo not too far from here for shelter. I looked at my watch, 9:32 a.m. to be exact. I began to stand up then. That's when it happened. It was so strange. I'd felt perfectly healthy that entire morning. But the moment I stood up, I felt lightheaded and dizzy. Now, you know how sometimes you can't help but stare randomly somewhere? Kind of like a yawn for your eyes. Well, that happened to me. I stood there, eye yawning into the cloudy sky, waiting for my faint spell to be over with. As it faded only seconds later, I looked back at my watch. Not sure why I did. Perhaps it was because that watch was new, and I was fond of it at the time. 1:24 p.m. I squinted my eyes and tapped the watch face. I looked at the sky again, struggling to see where the sun was beyond them. Nearly 4 hours had passed in the time it took me to stand up. I took off the watch then, tapping the back where the battery would be. I flipped it back around, making sure I couldn't see any water inside from the light rain. Quickly and nervously, I walked back down the trail. It was a longer walk than simply going ahead towards the gazebo, but I wanted to go back to my car. About an hour later, I had made it back. I threw my backpack inside and got in the driver's seat. I turned it on and looked right at the radio. 2:26 p.m. There was no way both my watch and my radio were wrong at the exact same time. I remember looking at both of them when I started my hike from this exact same spot earlier in the day. I then drove to the nearest ranger station, where two of my colleagues were. Lo and behold, after asking them the time, my car and watch turned out to be correct. Somehow, I had lost 4 hours of my life on that bluff without any explanation. As I stood leaning over the desk at the station, one of my coworkers, Tyler, asked if I was okay. I felt confident this time around to explain what happened. I think I was just so confused I needed to confide in someone. Tyler nodded as I recounted my tale, then oddly enough he replied, Yep, I've heard of that before. What do you mean? I asked. I've heard of this happening in Yellowstone twice before you started here. Hikers feeling dizzy, then suddenly they lose 4 hours. And it's always 4 hours, apparently. No idea why. Do you have any earthly idea what's causing it? Not really. I always hoped it was just people fainting and waking up without being aware of it. That being said, are you sure you didn't pass out for 4 hours up on the bluff? Absolutely not. I was standing up. I'd have a concussion now after hitting my head on the rocks under me. Weird. Well, I'll let you know if I hear of a similar story from one of the guests. And that was that. Very strange, very creepy. Where did the time go? I know I didn't faint. I never woke up at any point. I never felt bruising or pain on the back of my head or my back. And I didn't have dirt or pebbles on me, save for my legs and rear, which would have indicated that I had fallen on the ground. Those are my weird memories from Yellowstone. Again, nature is a beautiful thing, but be careful, because when the unexplained happens to you, it comes without warning. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at @DarkPrevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.